problems that motivate all of this anger and frustration. Let me start by just summarizing the argument of the book. Basically, I begin by reviewing half a dozen crises that I think of as pretty deep and intractable: economic problems, workplace disempowerment, political unresponsiveness of the government, environmental crises, social and international. I try to document as best I can the various dimensions of crises in those 6 aspects. I argue then that reforming capitalism certainly could mitigate some of the crises, but I try to argue the case to explain why I don't think any of these reforms can overcome them, that those crises are too deep-seated. But responding to them will cost too much for business, and government, were it to try to force business to absorb those costs, would essentially be undermining the viability of the capitalist economy that is the core of our societies. And so no government, no matter how well-meaning, is going to be able to really overcome these crises as long as the core of the economy remains capitalist. Conversely, in order to overcome them, I don't see any way to do that unless we assert some sort of democratic control over production and investment across the entire economy. And that in turn means that we need to socialize the ownership of those productive resources. So we then encounter a pretty straightforward issue, and I try in my book to deal with it in a pretty forthright way, namely that the socialist planning concept doesn't seem to ever work very well. Certainly not well enough to point to as an inspiring example to which we might try to emulate. In order to try to excite a younger generation around the idea of socialism in a sort of more full-blooded form that I'm arguing for, I tried to find a place where we could see something like socialist planning operating in a democratic and economically effective way, and offer as a working hypothesis that we could look inside some of our big corporations for models of planning that we could perhaps indeed refine and strengthen and scale up if we were to socialize the ownership of the economy's resources. So that, in a nutshell, is the argument of the book. Let me sort of backtrack and try to fill out for you the various steps in the argument. So yeah, I begin with half a dozen big crises: the economic rationality in all its forms, the obscene inequality, the pervasive sense of economic insecurity, recurrent bouts of terrible unemployment and persistent unemployment for all kinds of categories, the disgusting level of waste in our economy and the range of unmet needs. The irrationality of the capitalist market economy is pretty flagrant. A pretty widespread sense of disempowerment in our workplaces, not only because unions have been destroyed here in the United States, almost entirely in the private sector and constantly under attack in the public sector, but even just in the way work is organized, people feel deeply disengaged from their work, and their bosses don't listen to them, and they're all too conscious of that in the workplace. With a few exceptions, that sense of disempowerment is pretty widespread. The sense that government is unresponsive to popular needs, that hardly bears discussion. Poll after poll shows Americans, as in other countries, wanting their government to take a more active role in ensuring people's well-being, and government obviously unresponsive, essentially dominated by business concerns, unable and unwilling to respond to those popular demands. The environmental case for socialism is probably one of the single strongest right now. The unsustainability of the capitalist economy is all too obvious, and climate change being the most obvious of the dimensions of that, but all sorts of other dimensions as well. The destruction of biodiversity, the disruption of the nitrogen and phosphorus cycles. We are in quite an environmental mess. Social disintegration has so many different dimensions. I had a hard time knowing how to cut that chapter short, but whether it's the stress that people feel in their everyday lives, the physical abuse that so many women encounter, that so many children suffer, the inequities of our criminal justice system, health disparities, regional disparities, housing problems, education system, the social disintegration trends in capitalism are so profoundly distressing. We can easily enough understand where this call for some alternative system comes from. And then, of course, international conflict. It waxes and wanes, but at a time when we need international cooperation to solve so many of these problems, the obscenity of the international rivalry and competition that we see that blocks that competition, that obscenity is all too distressing. And to cap it off, the craziest thing that I think really turns a lot of young people against capitalism is that it's all too obvious that we have the resources, the technology, we have what it needs to make a decent life for everybody. And it really just doesn't have to be all this way. I would say, as I said, the environmental crisis is probably the single most obvious argument for socialism these days. So very often these days when I'm talking about my book, I just focus on the environmental crisis. But I think the range of crises that we face here helps explain this growing call for some radical change in the way the system works. I should say, the first port of call when people ask for remedies to these crises is to call on government to intervene. But I try to make the argument in the book, and I realize it's an argument that will upset many of my good friends, that there are good reasons to believe that government, as long as the core of the economy remains capitalist, no government is able to deal effectively, not with these 6 problems that we're talking about. Government can do all kinds of things. But at core, the half a dozen problems I begin with are really not amenable to resolution in any satisfactory way, as long as the economy has those capitalistic features: competition between firms that are competing for profits, subordination within the workplace as employees rather than cooperative owners, and the fact that government in the end isn't part of the economy, stands apart from the economy, and ends up representing the business class as a result. So that when government, even if we did elect better governments, and surely we need to try, the chances of them solving these problems are pretty limited, because were they to act as energetically as we'd need, the job losses would mount very quickly. Business resistance would manifest itself very quickly in the form of capital strike or flights. And the reality is, as sad as it is to say, many of us have so much admired the Nordic social democracies. The reality is that that system too has failed in the face of economic crisis, and as those countries have been absorbed into the international economy and international financial markets, the massive accumulation of household debts, the high levels of youth unemployment, the housing crises in many of these countries, the disempowerment that people feel even in workplaces where they've got a union representing them, the fact that they're constantly at the mercy of big capital interests has become pretty obvious in the social democratic Nordic countries too. So in a nutshell, it seems pretty obvious that to deal with these big crises that we're focused on, we need to somehow socialize the control, democratize the control over production and investment decisions, and considering the nature of the crises that we've just been talking about, that socialized control needs to be not just within individual enterprises, but it has to be essentially control over the entire economy through some sort of planning regime that enables us to decide rationally how to use our country's economic resources. Doing that is no mean feat. It's not like it's so obvious how we can get an economy-wide control that is simultaneously democratic and effective. There's 2 core issues here, and those of us who are committed socialists often don't take these questions very seriously. I tried in my book, since I was appealing, I wasn't writing the book for people who are already committed socialists. I'm writing it to bring people to a stronger, clearer socialist apprehension of the world. I think I've tried to deal as forthright as I can with the concerns that people have about the idea of economy-wide democratic control. Firstly, that it's never worked before. I don't think we can escape the fact that it's never worked before. Doesn't mean it can't. That's an elementary logical error to assume that because it hasn't, it can't. But it certainly puts the onus on us to make the claim, to make the argument to new people, to our movement, as to why we think this will work. And I think we face a problem that I've come around to calling our Aristotle problem, which is simply put that Aristotle was a pretty smart guy, but couldn't for the life of him imagine how ancient Greece's wonderful democratic system, how democratic decision-making rights could be extended to women or to slaves. He assumed that if those democratic decision rights were extended to women and slaves, that democracy would degenerate into rule by the rabble. And somehow, over the subsequent couple of thousand years, we've come around to assuming that democracy isn't a perfect system, but it's a pretty good principle by which to guide ourselves in the development of our polity. I think we face a problem like Aristotle faced in the difficulty of imagining how we would extend democratic decision rights from the political sphere into the economic sphere. The economic sphere is so much more complex and massive that people understandably have a hard time imagining what such an economy-wide, democratic, and effective system of planning would look like. So, in a nutshell, the novelty of my book, for those of you who are familiar with arguments about socialism, you won't find anything all that novel in the basic arguments. I try to present them as compellingly as I can, but if there is a novelty in the book, it's taking this idea to heart that capitalist enterprises operate like islands of planning, albeit in the sea of competition. That's not a new idea. That idea has been around for maybe 100 years now. People have observed that it's a strange thing about capitalism, that its central actors, big corporations, operate internally like planned economies. Some businesses set their little business units to compete with each other, but in most businesses, they do this thing they call strategic planning, strategic management, where they get all the business units to collaborate in a process of dialogue and discussion in order to ensure that their plans are aimed at maximizing the overall benefit of the corporation. Obviously, that goal is these days oriented towards profitability, but that planning process is rather interesting. And especially, I focused on firms that we sometimes call high road firms. High road in the sense that they're aiming to leverage the creativity and innovative capacity of their employees. Because sometimes that's a competitively very significant resource for these businesses, and so they reach out to lower level people to capture their more creative ideas about what they should be doing or how they could be accomplishing their goals. And since they need those creative ideas from people further down the corporate hierarchy, they develop rather impressively participative systems of planning. Obviously, they're very far from the kind of democratic planning that we would anticipate in a socialist world. But I think the argument in our book is that there's a lot we could learn by looking at the planning techniques that some of the smarter of these corporations have developed. And the logic is simple. These firms are looking for much the same benefits as we socialists are looking for from that planning process, in replacing democratic planning, I should say, in replacing markets with planning. Corporations are looking for much the same benefits as we're looking for as socialists in establishing some sort of societal level planning. They're looking to mobilize the resources, their resources for economies of scale and scope. They're looking to develop a critical mass of R&D experts and avoid duplicative research efforts so as to maximize their innovative capacity. We would be doing that in socialism too. They're trying to standardize best practices and components across the entire organization so as to improve the efficiency of their operations. And under socialism, we would try to overcome a lot of waste in capitalism by doing much the same thing, standardizing practices and components across the economy. And big corporations are indeed working to enhance the motivation of the people working within them by buffering people from the randomness of the market process, so that they can sustain their commitment to some shared goals in much the same way as in a socialist economy. We would be trying to align our fellow citizens towards our shared planned goals and clear the path for us to work together towards those goals. So there's similar goals that these big corporations are trying to attain through planning as we're trying to attain through planning at a societal level. And they encounter similar challenges. It turns out that it's a nice idea to look for synergies across your business units by developing some strategy that links their efforts. But That's encounters some pretty serious challenges in getting the local units to forward to headquarters valid data and ensuring that those local units are implementing those plans. That's a fairly serious problem in socialist planning that we've seen in the former Soviet Union and other socialist countries over the years. People worry about innovation under socialism because if there's not that pressure for market competition. And I think we've certainly saw some limitations on the capacity of socialist economies to innovate. Similarly, we're looking for efficiency through standardization, but it's hard to get that efficiency when that standardization creates rigidity and alienation. We saw that in other socialist experiments, and we see that in big corporations too. And yes, in terms of motivation, it's a nice idea to buffer people from the vagaries of the market, but big corporations have tried this too, and they encounter some interesting problems in the tension between the individualism they want in order for folks to come up with these creative ideas. They need to foster that sort of individualistic, divergent thinking, but at the same time, they need their employees to be willingly conforming to corporate policies. And we suffer a bit the same challenge in a socialist system, where we want people to be collectivistic and work towards the common good, but simultaneously want them to be individualistic and creative and innovative. So across a range of efforts, a range of dimensions, I think big corporations are looking for similar benefits within the firm as we're looking for at the societal level. They encounter similar challenges. And strangely, interestingly, intriguingly, they've developed some techniques that I think might help us make more concrete in people's minds how we, in a socialist economy, could overcome those same similar challenges. Obviously, I should say at the outset, under capitalist conditions, these techniques sort of come in and out of focus for big corporations. Even when they're implementing them on a good day, they're only ever implementing them partially. They often undermine the implementation of these techniques because the pressures of competitiveness force them to drop their focus on them. But nevertheless, I think if we squint a little bit, we can look inside these corporations and see some pretty interesting approaches that I think make more concrete for people the idea that we might be able to manage the whole economy in a democratic and effective way. So I give these techniques some strange sounding names on the terms of strategizing. I'll talk to you a bit more about what I mean by participative centralization. And that's the one that I thought we'd talk about a bit more today. Before I open up the discussion, I thought I'd give you a little clue as to what I meant by that. But I think across all four of these, there's interesting ways in which we see big corporations overcoming what seems like impossible tensions between standardization and innovation, between specialization and innovation, between individualism and collectivism. I don't want to spend too long because I'm eager to get the conversation going with you all, but maybe take a couple more minutes just to explain to you what this participative centralization one looks like, just to give you a bit of the flavor of the argument of the book. I use a few examples from big American firms to illustrate these various ideas in one of the chapters of my book. I discuss in particular a company I've had a chance to get to know. It's the biggest private sector healthcare organization in the US with about 10 million health plan members. It has an insurance arm, a healthcare delivery arm, and it employs its own physicians. So about 17,000 salary doctors, a total of about 180,000 employees, most of whom are unionized across a system of about 570 hospitals and medical facilities. Interestingly, for our purposes, they developed back in 1996 a partnership between the physicians' organizations and the hospital health plan and a big union coalition, a coalition of about 28 union locals. And that partnership enables the unions through their coalition to participate in decision-making at every level, at the national level, the regional level, right down to the working department level, where they have about 3,500, what they call unit-based teams that have management and union co-leads managing the day-to-day work within the organization. this collaborative strategizing process that I was referring to works. Let me just jump to the core of it. The whole system has identified four overarching goals. They call it their value compass. Best quality of clinical care, best service is experienced by their patients, most affordable. Interestingly, they're also committed to cost reductions and making healthcare more affordable, and best place to work. They have a massive degree of centralization, especially compared to the rest of the American health system, by integrating these 17,000 doctors who otherwise would be competing little private enterprises with the hospitals, which otherwise would be competing hospitals and with the insurance companies. All these components would, in the rest of the American healthcare system, be competing with each other. Instead, here it's Kaiser. We see them all integrated, working together towards these four value compass goals. Those value compass goals are cascaded down from the national level, down to the regions and the healthcare facilities, and right down to the working units, where people have quantified measures of the four key goals. Here on this slide, they're represented as clinical effectiveness or quality, safety, resource stewardship, service, and right down in the bowels of the organization, they're following the progress of each of their units, comparing them against each other, tracking how well they're contributing towards these different goals. The trick here is that these four goals weren't dictated by some CEO and his team or her team over the weekend. They were developed jointly with the union. The union and management worked over a period of about a year or so to define these shared goals. The organizations mobilized in order to develop plans for how to meet those goals. There's a whole hierarchy of labor management councils from that unit level right up to the national level, where they both bring forward new ideas from the rank and file upwards to senior management and senior union leadership, and cascade downward in the way that I just described to you, so that people can keep track of how well they're doing in working towards those planned goals. That process, I call it participative centralization. It sounds like a bit of an oxymoron because in capitalist organizations, we're used to centralization being used precisely as a means to avoid any participation by pesky workers who might have a different opinion about what the direction of the organization. But here we see, at least on a good day at Kaiser Permanente, we see this much more participative form of centralization where, yes, highly centralized, but at the same time, highly participative. And I think that's scalable for socialism. We could easily enough imagine transforming the entire American health system into something like Kaiser Permanente. Indeed, that's essentially what it would be, a national health service like we see in the UK, which we could imagine under socialist conditions, setting national goals democratically for such a healthcare system. We could plan the implementation of those goals democratically, ensure the public accountability of all the components of this healthcare system through various mechanisms. I'm very interested in what we need to do in order to ensure that the centralized aspect of this planning process be effective, but clearly we'll only centralize when we need to. Where a lot of planning can be decentralized. That's not, in the corporate world, we see that done all the time, and there's no reason why in a socialist planning process we couldn't do the same thing. But in order to make this work anywhere the way we'd need to, obviously it's going to have to be profoundly democratized relative to the systems we see at work at Kaiser. Much broader participation, strengthening the workers' role in decision-making, broadening the range of performance criteria they're looking at even further. And we'd obviously have to ensure that our whole political system is genuinely democratic if we're going to engage this kind of planning process. So let me wrap up with just a couple more thoughts. There's all sorts of reasons why people doubt that such a system of socialist planning could operate at this broader scale. I tried to anticipate as best I could some of the main concerns that people have. On this slide, if you're looking at it on video, I try to summarize a few of them, but in the conversation, I'm sure you'll bring up various concerns that you see facing such a system. And then in terms of getting there, obviously, the big challenge, we can cook up all these wonderful utopian visions, but getting from here to there is obviously a massive undertaking. I have a modest contribution to make on that score. It's not the primary insight of my book, but I do think I try to offer in the concluding chapter of my book some ideas as to why I think we've got reason to hope that such a system might but we might be able to make our way towards such a system, even if the path to it seems at the moment to be mainly through crisis opportunities, economic, environmental, or political crises. So let me just wrap up with a wonderful story that you might remember. This young fellow thought he could fly, and back in the 1600s built himself a bunch of saloons and jumped off the church tower and came a cropper. And our friend Bertolt Brecht wrote a wonderful poem about it that I think we should understand as his commentary on the failure of Soviet socialism. Those of you who are not on video, I'll just read it to you quickly. The poems is the Ulm 1592. Said the tailor to the bishop, believe me, I can fly. Watch me while I try. And he stood with things that looked like wings on a great church roof. That is quite absurd, a wicked, foolish lie. If a man will never fly, a man is not a bird, said the bishop to the king. Said the people to the bishop, oh, the tailor is quite dead. He was a stupid head. His wings are rumpled. He lies all crumpled on the hard church square. The bells ring out in praise. That man is not a bird. It is a wicked, foolish lie. Mankind will never fly, said the bishop to the people. Brecht was a kind of had a sharp tongue, but I think and we shouldn't. We don't want to be too flippant about the millions of people that have died in previous experiments to create socialism, and so I use this poem with some degree of caution. But the fact that socialism hasn't worked until now is not a reason to think that we can't reinvent and build a form of socialism that does in fact fly. So with that, let me forgive me please for going on so long, but in a nutshell, that's the thesis of my book, and I'm eager to get the discussion going with you all.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Paul. I'm sure you're quietly clapping into their muted microphones as a round of applause for this.
Yes, I am. Very good.
Thank you, Brian. So we'll open it up for discussion and questions. We've got a question here from Rory, which is the prize for having a written question already. For anyone on the phone, it's a longer question, but it's about the difference between so does Paul think that the examples of socialism at work failing are more to do with communism specifically rather than socialism? For example, the former Soviet Union, China, and he asks, I wonder how Cuba would fit into that equation. And in his expert opinion, how he defines the difference between, say, communism and socialism. He mentions that just last week in WA, the government paid approximately $86 million to revert privatisation of a hospital over there, and they acknowledged that privatisation failed, and that was the cost of getting out of it. I wonder how privatisation fits in with socialism. Is it capitalism at work and one of the potential failures? And he says it was a very, very, very good and a very interesting discussion. So yeah, we'll get off with a response to that question from Rory.
Right. Thank you. Yeah. So that's a good question, socialism versus communism. I've not tried to distinguish them. I would have happily called my book, how communism can overcome the crisis of capitalism. Communism, and often I'll describe myself as a small c communist, but folks don't have a clue what that means. Whereas the term socialism, I think, covers the territory that we want. I do. So there's a whole spectrum of views that we can call socialism. As I said, in the United States today, excuse me, let me kill these messages. As I said, socialism today in the United States is anything where the government does anything for anybody, except for rich people. Obviously, rich people, when government comes to bail out the banks, we don't call that socialism. We call it socialism for the rich, maybe. But yeah, the version of socialism I'm presenting is very far from the kind of socialism that is much further, shall I say, much further developed than the socialism that consists of putting into place some sort of social security schemes, some government-run healthcare plan, and for that matter, the social democracy that we see in the Nordic countries. I'm defining socialism in a much more full-blooded sense that I suppose you could call communism, if you will, where we socialize the ownership of society's means of production Uh, there might be a small sector of private enterprise, why not? But that the bulk of the strategically important economic resources are under democratic control. And to assert that democratic control, I don't see how we do that without democratizing and socializing ownership. So in one form or other, I don't see how we avoid that in the form of socialism. You're perfectly justified in calling it communism, as long as we gave it a small c, that I'm perfectly happy with that label.
Thank you, Paul. I've got about 10 questions, but I want to open up for others to ask verbally if you prefer that to writing a question. If anyone else got a question, let us know. Unmute yourself, of course. No, not so far. Maybe people are still unmuting. Well, I'm going to ask my question then, if that's okay. Oh, well, there we go. I've got a question from, that's from Max Gillies, but is that Paul's other sister, is it? So Paul, Bernie seems to be a goner. I don't agree, but that's what is the question. How has that tally with your optimism about the future of socialism in the US?
Yeah, my optimism is of a historical kind. There was a moment there where it seemed like it might be within our lifetimes. Some of us are a little older, so our lifetimes are looking ever shorter. But the reality is that we've not done the work needed to create the mass movement that could bring Bernie-style sort of more left-wing social democracy to fruition here in the United States. That became pretty serious. That became pretty obvious, I should say, with the failure of the youth vote in these primaries amongst the Democrats. I'm not sure that he's a total goner. We have a debate coming up between Bernie Sanders and Biden on Sunday. And it may yet be the case that Biden's mental decline becomes all too obvious, and that his political bankruptcy become equally obvious when the two of them are in head-to-head discussion. The amazing thing is that Bernie Sanders has made as much progress as he has in a context where very, very few Americans have ever heard somebody make a serious argument for socialism. We've never had a presidential candidate up on a stage making an argument for anything, even the kind of left-wing social democracy that Bernie's arguing for is quite foreign to any American political discourse in living memory. So you have to really go back to the beginning of the 20th century to find anything comparable. And so the amazing thing is that when people hear Bernie Sanders talk, even if they come into the room initially totally hostile, most people end up loving the man. He did a town hall a few days ago for Fox News. And when he started talking about Medicare for all, the audience gave him a standing ovation. They loved it, the Fox audience. So Americans have never had much exposure to these ideas, thanks to the dominance of the Democratic Party by big corporate interests. These more socialistic ideas have never been on the radar screen. So I think we've got a long way to go in building the kind of movement that we need. But I think the success he's had demonstrates a real opening for us. If we want to put our shoulder to the wheel, there's reason to be hopeful that we can make some real progress here.
Thanks for that. I'll open it up again as well to any further verbal questions.
Well, I'll ask one, Luke, if that's all right. Although you were going to ask one earlier, so I'll come in behind you if you like.
No, you go first.
Thanks very much, Paul. And the question about Bernie goes to the heart of an issue that I've got your book and I've dipped into it. I haven't read it word for word. But it seems to me the big issue is how to get from where we are today, whether in the US or Australia or European countries, to where we want to be. I'm very interested in your angle on how management is developing in some big companies. And in fact, Laurie Carmichael, the famous communist trade union leader here in the manufacturing industry, had some thoughts that relate to that, which is that, which was at that time, that the work process itself was changing and requiring more input and intellectual and democratic participation by the workforce themselves, and he saw that also as a very important development within capitalism. But I thought that it would be good if, developing from your book, there'd be a wider discussion about, just how do we get from where we are today to where we want to be. And I agree with what you've said about Bernie Sanders. He's put a whole lot of very important issues on the agenda. But clearly the Democratic Party mass base is now swinging in behind what they see, probably wrongly, but nevertheless that's how they see it, as the best person who can defeat Trump. And that goes to a whole issue of, Gramsci's idea of the ruling class of any given era. It's their ideas and their culture, their values that tend to have hegemony, as he called it. And I think, you talked about building a movement, and I think that is the vital question, but it's how that fits in with the bigger picture ideas that your book is discussing, and how you actually overcome, and particularly in the case of America, that traditional acceptance, if you like, that system as it is the way to go, and you can just get little improvements in it, but that's it.
Yeah.
So it's about a strategy, in other words, from where we are now to where we want to be.
Okay. So a couple of thoughts. One is, I do think, like Laura Carmichael, I've made very similar arguments that the path of capitalist development in general seems to be towards, albeit slowly, towards a more educated, more sophisticated working class. We've got every reason to be frustrated with how uneven that development path is and how many people seem to be left aside and cast aside. But I do think the evolution of the capitalist labor process gives us a working class that's increasingly sophisticated, even though sometimes you do despair. So that's an important asset. I don't think that there's any way that these corporations, even with the more engaged working class and the more participative work process, I don't think there's a pathway from there that leads us to socialism. It's these corporations. My book is sometimes, but before people read it, my book, some people get the idea that my book is arguing that somehow these corporations are nascent socialism. That's not at all the point. My point is that these corporations, in their internal planning processes, give us a miniature working model of the kind of planning processes that we could scale up and use at a societal level, and that they give us ways of imagining what that world might look like. And in particular, I confess to willingly that for younger people today, it's very hard, and this was the Aristotle problem I began with, it's just very hard to imagine what it would be like to plan a whole economy. And so when I focus their attention on the way these big corporations function, those of them who've been in the workplace and seen that strategic planning process at work, they usually hold it in considerable disdain, a very well-earned disdain, I should say. But they recognize that no, the general manager of the Walmart store doesn't haggle with the manager of the Walmart warehouse over the price and quality of the next pallet of T-shirts that they're going to have delivered. All of those things are decided at headquarters at Walmart, and these little business units within Walmart, they might treat them as business units, but they're in fact integrated by some planning process. And so my idea was simply to make more concrete for especially young people who hadn't read deeply in the history of socialism, to make more concrete for them the idea of democratic and effective planning at a wide, complex system. Now, to your second point, how do we get from here to there? I confess that I, as I said earlier, I don't claim to have any brilliant new insight on this. As best I can tell, there's a good reason why Marx and Engels thought that this process was going to require some pretty violent rupture, that we might want to make it a peaceful, gradual, democratic transition. But these bastards are not going to give up without a fight. They own the damn society. Why would you expect them to give up just because a vast number of people voted that we should be able to take control of these economic resources? They're their resources as far as they're concerned. So no, they're not going to give up without a fight, no matter who we elect into Congress or the White House or any of our country's governments. So that doesn't make me any the less optimistic. I think we have three axes of crisis, which are all too real. The environmental crisis is going to make it impossible for a capitalist system to function in anything but a totalitarian form. We face a real fork in the road, I think, with the imminent sort of collapse of civilization associated with climate change. This is not 50 and 100 years out. This is a matter of a decade or two. We are going to have tens of millions of people just in the United States alone. We're going to have 1 billion people fleeing coastal cities around the world as sea levels start to rise. That is going to create chaos. In the face of that chaos, we're going to need, energetic, emergency measures. And those are either going to be democratically oriented, or they're going to be authoritarian, totalitarian, and or I suppose the third alternative is that the whole system break up and we end up with a bunch of warlords on hilltops. So I think that's not a prospect that I'm looking forward to, but I think that it's a very imminent prospect as I see it, that the environmental crisis is going to force a lot of people to stand up and ask, well, how are we going to mobilize our economic resources to deal with this crisis? The economic crisis is already unfolding before our very eyes in just this last week in the United States. We have a massive meltdown of the economy. They may well be able to inject enough liquidity into it and sort of start the capitalist machinery again, but the capitalist economy generates these periodic crises, of which we've had two now just in quick succession. And in the face of those economic crises, as millions of people are thrown out of their home, at some point, we might imagine that people are going to stand up and say, this is nuts. We need a different system. And then third, if we were to elect a Bernie Sanders or a Liz Warren or somebody with a bit more guts than Biden, they would try to bring their agenda to Washington. They would be confronted with an absolutely hostile business class. Even if they had a majority in the House and the Senate and they owned the White House, they would be faced with implacable opposition from the business sector. And then we'd be faced with the typical dilemmas of social democracy. Either we fall back and we retreat from our ambitious goals, which is essentially what every social democratic party has done to date in the face of real crisis and real business class pushback, or we fall forward and we push it, we start nationalizing some of these industrial sectors where the opposition to our program is most ferocious. So Bernie Sanders' Green New Deal program with AOC, for example, portends the nationalization of vast sectors of the energy industry. That's a beginning of a wider process. So my optimism has a pretty dark form, but I do think we have reason to be optimistic because capitalism is really in its geriatric phase. The failures of capitalism seem to be multiplying, and I do think that confronts us with some opportunities as well as some very dark dangers.
Great answer, thank you. I'll throw it open again to anyone on the line, particularly people who are using their phones, to ask a question before I ask mine.
I noticed a few questions on the chat there, but I'll let you decide how to handle them.
No worries. Yes, there's a bit of comment as well, a bit of just discussion too. Is that Richard Archer? Were you looking to ask a question there? You look like you're about to. You're muted, mate. I'll let you sort that out. Or your mic's not quite working. You might have to type it out. You're still. Your mic's not working there, Richard. We'll have to come back to you.
Let me maybe say one more thing about Brian's question. And because I'd love to get your thoughts on this. You've all been deeply engaged in thinking about this. Somehow we need to build some kind of a mass organization, some kind of progressive. I mean, once upon a time, we had an image of what a revolutionary party looked like. It's not, I don't see around me today any great models of what a revolutionary organization of the kind that would propel us towards this socialism. I don't see any great models. I see a lot of young people enamored of horizontalism, very disdainful of centralized decision making, very skeptical of my participatory centralization model. That's one of the purposes of that's one of my goals in the book, to try to dislodge them from their hostility to centralization. But I have no idea what this kind of mass movement, organized movement, would look like in the United States, where obviously the Democratic Party is just a shambolic vehicle for big money's interest. But we have a mass of quite dispersed social movements of various kinds without any integrative architecture. I don't see anywhere around us in the world inspiring examples of mass movements that are sufficiently organized to really drive this process, to agitate, educate, organize, really do the work that needs to be done. Do you? Does anybody on the line help me? Does anybody have any ideas here? Is Podemos, I mean, no, this is not going to get us where we need to go. The rejuvenation of the Labour Party, is that what we're talking about? That's a pretty tough haul. Tell me what you all are thinking.
Well, I might jump in there. We've had a couple of articles in Search News recently from correspondents from Chile and from Lebanon, but obviously quite, peripheral to the, both the world economy. If you on the progressive movement, on your Facebook, people post things from New Zealand, Iceland, and Finland, where we've got these young social democratic leaders who, people seem to sometimes fetishize a bit. But again, they are all very peripheral, very small countries in the, far-flung parts of the world, and they are electoral, coalitions essentially, rather than mass movements, as it were. Whereas, legitimately Chile and Lebanon are. I suppose you look at also, the really big Indonesia and India, and see there's obviously very large working class movements in those places, but they are often put in their place by very authoritarian regimes, as we know. So, anyone else wants to throw in places, models that you'd be looking at, I'd be very interested to hear it myself, so that we can learn from them.
Yeah, I think somehow we have to reinvent what, that party form was a very powerful form of organization in the 20th century. But I don't know what the 21st century equivalent looks like. It's all I know is that it's not just some random network, of people connected by social media. That's not going to do the work that needs to be done. But what it's going to look like is going to be fascinating to see. It's I think a big challenge for us to rebuild and reconceptualize what those movements are going to look like.
That goes a bit to my question, actually, is knowing that what you're talking about does involve some quite complex systems. And obviously Kaiser Permanente went from a simple system to a more complex system, or a failing system to a more efficient and better system. So are there institutions or pressure points or models in either the current capitalist context where you see a move from simple to complex happening? Perhaps, the idea of economic councils and enterprise level, I suppose, by pointing out Permanente, that's what you've done. But if we do get social movements and people involved in political parties that can point at an institution currently which could be strengthened or developed into more complex, which will help give people the reference point so they can say, yes, that works. Like, Bernie Sanders does with the world has got pretty much universal healthcare except for the United States. And as you said, Medicare for All is now incredibly popular with Democratic voters. Funnily enough, more popular than Bernie Sanders is with Democratic voters. So a bit like, nationalising the railways was more popular than Jeremy Corbyn was. And in Australia, social democratic policies are more popular than the Labor Party is. So yeah, is there other than Kaiser Permanente, I suppose, institutions which might move from simple to complex, where if we can push to push those forward, if we can get a bit of beyond a loose network of people, as you say.
So maybe I'm not getting your point exactly, but I would say that my book is a little perverse in focusing on these big corporations as miniature working models of socialist planning. Arguably, it would have been more productive for me to focus on some of the more successful public sector agencies. You know, in Australia, you've got some admirable public sector organizations. In the United States, we have a Veterans Healthcare Administration, which is it's big as Kaiser Permanente, and actually, you know, it's a public sector organization. It's working pretty well.
That's exactly what I was asking about.
Yeah. So we've got a few places like that, and that's actually my next task for research. I'd like to try to start documenting some of those. In many cases, as we know all too well, because of the resistance of the business community, those public sector organizations are often deliberately hobbled and handicapped, underfunded by conservative governments, constantly attacked. You know, the more successful parts of them hived off for privatization. So it was not an obvious place to go looking for inspiring models, but I know there are some gems out there, and we should be alerting people to just how effective they are, rather than, there's plenty to be criticized. This is a capitalist state that we're talking about, and apparatuses of the capitalist state are infused and constrained in all kinds of ways. On the left, we're very used to critiquing them for their limitations, but I think we should maybe just spend more time celebrating some of the ways in which they are responsive to people's real needs, and provide us with a bit of a template, perhaps a more obvious template than my big corporations, a real template that we could build on as we build out a more expansive public sector that takes in charge, a wider range of our needs, not just in these public goods areas like health and infrastructure, but more central parts of our economy, like energy generation, for example, or basic transportation. At some point, we may have to nationalize, or it might be a good idea to nationalize the automobile industry and actually do something productive with it, rather than producing these ridiculous SUVs. So I think, finding some public sector organizations and celebrating them as inspiring examples of what we could build out, that might be a path forward for us.
Yeah, that was exactly what I was asking around. Any further questions from people online? I've just heard that Peter Dutton has been diagnosed with coronavirus, which shouldn't celebrate, of course, but if Bolsonaro...
I think it's terrible, Luke. It's shocking.
It's shocking. It's terrible. Jair Bolsonaro, I'm pretty sure, has given it to Trump myself. But Dutton's got it. So other questions that people might have beyond giving us that interesting news?
I want to know how he got it.
Inappropriate touching, I think we call it.
Yeah. Biden's up for it. From the nanny, says your sister. Very good. More serious questions from anyone on the line?
I would say, while we're at it, while people are working out how to unmute themselves, perhaps, I do think this coronavirus situation is a lovely situation for demonstrating the failures of our private enterprise system's capacity to respond to a crisis. It's not just Trump's ineptitude; it's our reliance on the private sector to develop the test kits, to get them out to people. Our reliance on the public sector to take in hand the urgency of this crisis is what's killing us. So I think the death toll from this particular virus might make for another pretty powerful argument for a pretty deep transformation of important sectors of the healthcare world.
That's right. I've managed to get a question through from Richard Archer, who is there on the line. He's asking about the ownership of Kaiser. So how much of it is owned by the pension funds, sort of thing.
So Kaiser, I use a bunch of different examples in my book. Tonight I focused on Kaiser, and Kaiser is itself actually a complex organization. The physicians' organizations are for-profit professional corporations. The healthcare, the hospitals and health plan are actually not-for-profit organizations. They still have to get funding from the bond market. So I think it's fair to characterize them as basically capitalistic organizations, but they are definitely a better place to work and a more open-minded management team than you find in the for-profit sector of American healthcare. But the organization as such is a mix of legally speaking, for-profit sector and a not-for-profit sector in a coalition. But the not-for-profit is not like a government type organization. It's not accountable to the way a public sector organization would be accountable in Congress to congressional oversight. It's run as a not-for-profit with its own board, but because of its reliance on external financing from the bond market, it has to satisfy standard expectations for return on investment.
Another question from Rory about, and I realise we're going a little over time here, so we have hit the formal sort of hour mark. I'll take it as an extension of motion for an extension of time has come through and been accepted by everyone since Paul is still awake, but maybe we should start wrapping up. It's been fascinating. So Rory asks, does globalisation figure in your book as a failure of private enterprise? And it was actually something I was really impressed with about the in the book as well, the diagnosis, if you like, of the unequal international economy, which is something that, Yannis Varoufakis obviously talks about in the context of Europe and generally so.
Yeah, so I'm a bit more orthodox in my Marxism. I think of globalization as a fundamentally progressive thing. You'll forgive me. In the same way Marx and Engels did in the Communist Manifesto. I think the downsides of globalization are all too obvious. There's no doubt that that it's used as a weapon of war against the working class in the more advanced countries, to be sure. But at the same time, it creates an objective foundation for solidarity across countries that otherwise would have existed in a purely competitive relation with each other. And so I think we should be alert to the positive potential of globalization, even at the same time as we fight against the terrible costs that it's created for workers, who've lost their jobs to outsourcing to other countries. The globalization of the financial markets, is a machine of war against any initiative at a national scale. It's a big challenge I face with the argument of my book. Luckily, I'm here in the US, and so I get to say, well, the US is big enough, we could probably do what we want with our economy here in the United States and without too little. But in a smaller economy, embedded in a globalized financial system, this is a really difficult challenge, how far we could get with any of these ideas before the international financial markets tried to shut you down. But the reality is the idea of capital controls. Even the IMF came around to recognizing that had Malaysia and South Korea had stronger capital controls in place, they would have been less damaged by the international financial markets crashes of the 1990s. So I think we need a nuanced analysis of globalization. It's not only a failure of capitalism, it's also part of its historical civilizing mission, we can say. No, we're not allowed to say that. I appreciate why not. But there is some profoundly positive side to this, I think, too.
Thank you. Let's take one more question. I know we could talk about this probably all night. A comment there from Rose. Sobering to think there's no first mover advantage unless it's the US. That's a fair point. More a point than a question. Has anyone got a question they'd like to throw in before we wrap up?
I do, actually. My question really, or comment, is about scale. I suppose, in light of, the massive sizes of corporations, sends shudders down my spine thinking that might be the model. And neither do I want to seem sort of naive about, the difficulties of attaining, scale in for socialism at, a countrywide level. But was always sort of struck by the concepts that Schumacher had in Small is Beautiful, about a sense of accountability to where you live and the community in which you function. And so I'd just be interested to see or to hear from you how you address that issue of a sense of connection and accountability back to the broader society.
Yeah, thank you for raising that issue, Rose. It's such an important one. I suppose I have a couple of thoughts. One is, as I said in passing, as I was presenting the ideas of the book, I focus on the challenges of managing the centralized, massive, the massive scale of centralized decision making. Not all these decisions will be made centrally. As many as possible should be made on a local basis, and we should only centralize where we need to. But when we need to ensure that that decision-making process is democratic, and there's a lot of decisions that have to be made centrally in a modern economy. To deal with these crises that we're talking about, we are going to need a national level, and for that matter, international level planning. And so my focus has been on trying to let people imagine what that would look like. Because unless we have a good answer there, what we're left with is an image of society that's entirely localistic. And I don't see how we get where we need to go by reverting to a more decentralized model. Let me put it very simply. I do not want to break up Walmart and return to the 100,000 small grocery stores that Walmart displaced. Walmart is infinitely easier. Let's nationalize Walmart. We'll be able to give workers there better conditions, make it more environmentally responsive, and indeed ask Walmart store managers to be responsive to their local communities. And for that matter, to have accountability to those local communities, as well as to the national retail distribution enterprise. I don't want to break up America's big banks. I want to nationalize the bastards and turn them into our instrument at a national level. And indeed, yes, they'll have local offices at the state level, at the regional level, at the city level, and there needs to be interconnections between those local offices and those local communities. One doesn't negate the other. So yes, there's a balance between decentralization and centralization. We should decentralize as much as possible. And I think it's true, my book has nothing to say. I probably should have had more to say about how to embed the local elements of decision-making in the local community more effectively. But I do think the big challenge, especially in the United States, we have this romanticism about decentralization that is an absolute roadblock to any serious thinking about socialism. The romanticism in the American left, as if we were going to return to this 19th century yeoman Republican decentralized world, that romanticism completely undercuts any capacity to create a national organization, a national movement, any national consensus about our priorities. And so that's why I kept the focus on how we can ensure that centralized decision-making is democratic and yields the kind of innovative, efficient, effective economy that we all want. Does that maybe that doesn't satisfy you, Rose, but I thank you for the challenge, because I think it is a failure of my book that I don't talk more about what it means for the local decision-making to be embedded in local communities the way Schumacher and others have pleaded for. But I think somehow we have to marry that with an emancipatory vision of centralized decision-making.
Thank you. I think that's an excellent outline, and I really appreciate. And yeah, these things can get fine-tuned, and what you're saying is something that I've certainly not heard before. So a very interesting thesis, and I'll be stewing over that one.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Indeed, within Search, being the broad church we are, we've got Anitra Nelson, who has, I think, coming up with a new book. She had Small is Beautiful, which is probably the complete other end of that spectrum of that discussion. So a couple of Victorians that can argue that. But I think it's a very important contribution to make. And, for my part, I'm probably more on your end, Paul, than the other, but that's a debate that, people need to have. And I think, as you say, there's a bit of a fashion for very anarchistic sort of approach and communitarian kind of thinking that may not actually be possible now that the world has sort of moved on. I'll throw it open for one last question, knowing that, Paul, it's nearly 1 o'clock in the morning where you are. So if anyone's got one last question to ask of Paul, please shoot it off now.
Don't hold back. I can talk about socialism all night.
You might need to get a glass of wine in your hand. That's the. We should do this every Friday. I'm loving it.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yep. Look, just one thought. I've been following the US elections and particularly Bernie's rallies that are absolutely fantastic and inspirational to look at and absorb. And I noticed that one of the things he does all the time, which I think is terrific, is to emphasise, I mean, he's got the slogan, not me, us, for a start, which of course is good in itself, because it contrasts him with the others who are only about themselves. But he also talks about the need for an ongoing movement. And I suspect from that he probably had in mind, well, what if I don't make it? We've still got to keep a movement alive out of this campaign. And it gives me a bit of hope for the future in the States, and that following the campaign, that there'll be efforts, you know, I mean, people are going to be bloody saddened by what's happened and to some extent demoralised, but there is going to be something coming out of all this that will be ongoing. And I just was wondering if you've got any, I know it's a little bit off the topic, but it is related, and I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, but my thoughts are pretty pessimistic. I've been trying to get more insight into the question you're asking. I think it's exactly the right question. I have to say, all the news I'm getting is not very comforting. It seems for the main part as if efforts to build this movement consist of building a big database. It's not, there is local organization happening, but essentially only in an electoral form. You get, if you sign up for Bernie's campaign, you get 20 text messages a day asking for money, and about one text every 3 months asking you to vote on some idea as to, you know, what Bernie might bring forward as an idea in the next debate, which is pretty cool. But that's not an organized movement. That's not a movement. That's just a listserv. And I know there's a lot of people around him who would like to see this take some real more organized form as a movement, but so far it has not come together, and we're not seeing any inklings of it. I think there's just the reality of an electoral campaign swamps any serious efforts along those lines. And I just think as a practical matter, they have no capacity to do both at the same time, and that's a real problem. I think the other part of it that's going on is that Bernie Sanders is probably smart enough to realize he can't at the same time be a presidential candidate, or for that matter, even a senator, and the head of a political organization, a separate political organization. That's got to be somebody else's job. He can be the mascot, if you will, for them. He can be their representative, but he can't be, you know, the party secretary, right? And that's not the role he's been playing. And so there's other people who have to build that organization. And sad to say, so far, I'm seeing very little progress on that front. As important as it is, I think we're still at square zero on that one. Sorry to end on such a downer note. I wish I could bring you better news on that front. And maybe there's something cooking in the background that I'm unaware of, but so far we've not seen any signs of the emergence of anything more organized than that.
Well, we've got a comment there from Rory about do you feel the desire to reach out and to lead or start a movement yourself? So I think you've inspired Rory on that one, which I think shows that you've done a great job tonight, and really want to thank you for it. I think everyone will join me again in silently applauding you, as we have to do on these Zoom conferences, for being there. There we go. There's Rose clapping.
Thanks very much, Paul.
Well, thank you. Thank you all. It's really been a treat to get a chance to
Thank
sit down.
you.
It'd be good to continue the discussion in some form or other.
Yeah, I agree with that very much. And with Paul coming out to Melbourne, economic and social collapse permitting in August, hopefully we might be able to find somewhere in your schedule to do something at the New International Bookshop. Maybe ever get you to come up to Sydney on a side trip. We'll see how we go, but we'll be in education. And again, we'll send out a link to Search members so they can buy the book and follow up as well about places where they can get it in person. But yes, thank you very, very much for being there. It's been wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll post this to YouTube when it's all done, and hopefully lots of people will tune into that and listen to what you said, which has been fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Paul.
Thank you all. Terrific. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.